It was a quiet afternoon when the doorbell rang, cutting through the stillness of the house. The kind of ordinary day that felt like the calm before a storm. In the living room, Sarah, mother of two, was sitting with a cup of coffee in her hand, flipping through a magazine while her 17-year-old son, Jack, lounged on the couch, absorbed in a video game. Outside, the sun streamed lazily through the windows, casting warm beams of light across the hardwood floors. Life seemed perfect. But the sound of that doorbell, it felt wrong. With a sigh, Sarah set her cup down and rose to answer the door, her mind distracted by thoughts of grocery shopping and work deadlines. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, two men in dark suits stood on the doorstep. Their sharp, professional appearance made them seem official, almost intimidating. They flashed brief, polite smiles, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of them began, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "We're with the Homeowners Association. We need to speak with your son, Jack." Sarah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. HOA officers. She didn't recall any scheduled inspection or meeting. She had no reason to believe anything was amiss, but the request felt too abrupt, too sudden. "Jack's not in trouble, is he?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral, though a flicker of worry tugged at her gut. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We just need to speak with him regarding a violation. It'll only take a moment." He glanced over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the house as if checking for something. A wave of unease washed over Sarah, but she pushed it aside. "It's probably nothing," she reassured herself. After all, they were supposed to be representatives of the HOA, right? But then something about their presence, their precise movements, the tightness in their posture, began to unsettle her. She hesitated. "I'll just go get him," Sarah said, her voice shaky as she stepped back into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar. The men followed her inside, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the quiet house. She called out to Jack, who appeared from the living room, still holding his game controller. "Jack, some men from the HOA are here to speak with you about something," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the growing sense of dread in her chest. Jack, initially nonchalant, raised an eyebrow as he looked at the two men. He didn't know them, and the way they stood, blocking the hallway, gave off a strange, almost menacing vibe. The two men exchanged a brief glance before one of them spoke again. "It's very important that we speak with him alone, ma'am. We wouldn't want to cause any unnecessary disturbances." His words hung in the air like a warning, though Sarah couldn't pinpoint why. Jack, sensing the tension, shifted uncomfortably. "Do you mind if I just grab my phone real quick?" he asked, trying to brush it off as a simple inconvenience. But as he reached for his phone, the men moved in closer. Their posture grew rigid. There was something predatory about the way they positioned themselves around him, as if circling him like sharks. Before Sarah could react, one of the men stepped forward, grabbing Jack's arm a little too forcefully. Jack stumbled, surprised by the sudden grip. "Hey!" Sarah shouted, her voice sharp, her heart pounding in her chest. She instinctively stepped toward them, but before she could say anything more, one of the men shoved Jack roughly against the wall. The sound of it sent a jolt through her. Suddenly, this didn't feel like a simple HOA visit. It felt like an attack. "Stop!" Sarah cried, her mind racing. Was this some kind of mistake? But her gut was telling her otherwise. These weren't just HOA officers. These men weren't here to enforce fines. They were here to do something far worse. As Jack pushed against the wall, struggling to break free, Sarah's breath hitched. She was now caught in the middle of something she didn't understand, and the urgency of the situation made her heart race. She had to do something, anything, before this went too far. With fear coursing through her veins, Sarah stepped forward, her mind screaming for her to protect her son, but she had no idea what she was about to face. The sudden aggression was a shock, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She took a step forward, but as she reached out to grab Jack, one of the men turned sharply, pushing her back. The force of his hand on her chest was enough to stagger her, and for a split second, she felt a rush of panic. She couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. These men weren't here to discuss property fines. The thought hit her like a punch to the gut. "Stop! Let go of him!" Sarah yelled, her voice raw with panic. But the man holding Jack only tightened his grip, his fingers digging into her son's arm with a cruel, almost practiced precision. Jack gritted his teeth, struggling to break free, but the stranger's hold was firm. The other man, the one who had remained eerily quiet, moved to block Sarah's escape. He smiled coldly, his eyes narrowing. The smile didn't reach his eyes. There was no warmth in it, just an unsettling sense of cold calculation. "Ma'am, please step back. This is an HOA matter," the second man said, his tone deliberately calm and empty, like a script. "Your son needs to comply." Jack, his face turning red with frustration, shoved against the wall, trying to shake off the man's grip, but the harder he fought, the tighter the hold became. "What the hell is going on?" Jack shouted, his voice cracking. "Who are you guys?" His words hung in the air, unanswered. The more Sarah watched, the more she realized that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This wasn't an official visit. These men didn't care about an HOA fine. They were here for something far darker. And whatever that something was, it was about to unfold in her living room. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, each thud a reminder that time was slipping away. Sarah's mind raced. Should I call the police? But her phone was on the kitchen counter, too far to reach in this frantic moment. She was alone with two men who didn't belong here, and who clearly had no intention of leaving. A wave of desperation flooded her chest. Then, in a split second of clarity, something else crossed her mind. The only thing that could help her now. Sarah's eyes darted to the corner of the room, where a heavy metal sculpture sat near the bookshelf. Without thinking, she lunged toward it, grabbing the solid piece of art in one swift movement. The weight of it felt right in her hands, and her mind zeroed in on the attackers. She'd have to be quick. One wrong move, and it could get worse. Her fingers tightened around the sculpture as she whipped back around. Just as one of the men looked over his shoulder, she swung the sculpture toward him with all her might. The blow landed with a loud thud, knocking the man off balance and sending him crashing to the floor. The sudden sound of impact caught the other man off guard, and his grip on Jack faltered. Jack, now freed from his captor's grasp, took a quick step back, eyes wide with disbelief. For the briefest moment, Sarah could see the same shock reflected in her son's eyes. Both of them were realizing just how wrong this was. But before they could react, the man who had fallen scrambled to his feet, rage now painted across his face. "You've made a huge mistake," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched as though to grab Sarah by the throat. But she was ready. In the chaos, a cold realization washed over Sarah. These men weren't just here to intimidate. No, this was a test, and she had just passed the first one. But what was their endgame? Why had they targeted her family? In that split second, the tension in the room thickened like an invisible weight. Sarah's breath quickened as the man charged toward her. Everything else blurred around her. She didn't have much time. One wrong move, and she'd lose the advantage. She gripped the sculpture tighter, prepared for whatever came next, as the room seemed to hold its breath. The man who had been knocked to the ground scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in fury. He wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, his eyes flashing with dangerous intent. Sarah's heart raced, but her grip on the heavy sculpture tightened, every muscle in her body now tense with the weight of what was to come. "You think that was clever?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret that." Sarah didn't wait for him to make his next move. Without hesitation, she swung the sculpture again, this time aiming lower, targeting his legs to unbalance him. The blow connected with a sickening thud, and the man's knee buckled under the impact. He crashed to the floor with a howl, momentarily stunned. But Sarah didn't stop. She wasn't about to give him time to recover. Her mind raced. This wasn't just a break-in. These men were part of something far darker. The fear of her son's safety and the unknown threat pressing in around them surged through her veins, and the protective instinct kicked in like a primal force. Behind her, Jack let out a sharp breath, the panic still evident in his voice. "Mom, what are they doing? Who are these guys?" Sarah glanced back, her eyes locking with his, desperate to communicate the urgency of the situation. "I don't know, but they're not here for an HOA fine. They're dangerous. Stay behind me." The second man, the one who had been blocking the way earlier, lunged toward Sarah with terrifying speed, his hands outstretched like claws. It was clear that he was trained. His movements were too fluid, too calculated. In that instant, Sarah realized they weren't dealing with average criminals. These men knew how to fight. She had only a split second to react. The man reached for her throat, but Sarah sidestepped at the last moment, using her own body's momentum to throw him off balance. He stumbled, a dangerous growl escaping his lips, and she seized the opportunity to strike. She swung the sculpture again, this time connecting with the side of his head. The impact sent him reeling back, dazed and disoriented. But Sarah wasn't finished. She was fighting for her life and her son's safety, and nothing could stand in her way. The man dropped to the floor, disoriented but not yet finished. His hand reached for the gun holstered under his jacket, but before he could pull it out, Sarah kicked it out of his reach, knocking it across the room. Jack, still recovering from the shock of the initial attack, rushed forward, his fists clenched. "Mom, I can help." "No," Sarah shouted, a surge of fear rushing through her. "Stay back, Jack. It's too dangerous." But before she could turn back to the second man, the first attacker, the one she had struck in the legs, lunged at her again. This time, he came at her with a wild desperation, his fists swinging wildly. Sarah barely managed to dodge one punch, but the second one landed square on her shoulder, causing a jolt of pain to shoot through her arm. She gritted her teeth against the pain, but the force of his punch left her off balance. The room spun for a moment, and Sarah realized just how outmatched she was despite her training. These men weren't just attackers, they were experts. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Sarah's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. "I can't lose now," she thought, her eyes locking onto Jack, who was still standing frozen, fear written across his face. "I can't let them hurt him." In that moment of clarity, something inside Sarah snapped. Her muscles coiled with renewed strength. She pushed past the pain and the fear, drawing on every ounce of her MMA training. The fight wasn't just physical anymore. It was a battle for her family's life. With a swift movement, Sarah ducked under the next punch aimed at her face, using the momentum to grab the man's arm and twist it behind his back. A quick knee to the gut left him gasping for air. But it wasn't enough to bring him down. She had to finish this, before he could call for backup, before it was too late. "Jack, get to the phone." Sarah hissed between clenched teeth, her voice hard with urgency. "Call the police. Now." But as she turned her attention back to the man, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. A small radio tucked into the attacker's belt. It crackled with static, and Sarah realized the worst possible scenario. These men weren't alone. There was a larger group outside, waiting. This was a coordinated attack. Her stomach dropped. The fight was just beginning. The second attacker, still reeling from Sarah's brutal knee strike, staggered back, clutching his midsection. His face contorted with pain and rage, but there was something else there too, a flicker of fear. It lasted only a moment before he masked it, but it didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. His desperation was palpable. He wasn't just a thug. He was someone who knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. Sarah barely had time to process the thought before the first man, the one who had been knocked down earlier, came charging back at her. His movements were more frantic now, less controlled, driven by pure adrenaline. He swung wildly, but Sarah, fueled by fear and survival instinct, dodged with a graceful but lethal fluidity. "Stay down," she snapped, pushing him back with all her strength. She didn't have time to waste. The realization hit her like a cold, hard slap. This was no random attack. These men weren't here for the HOA fines. They had something much darker in mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden crackle of the radio clipped to the first man's belt. The unmistakable voice of a third figure came through, this one deep and commanding, like a shadow hanging over the entire room. "Status report," the voice barked. Sarah froze, her eyes locked on the radio, a sinking feeling spreading through her chest. This was bigger than she thought. The attack wasn't just about intimidating a single family. It was coordinated, organized. These men were part of something far more dangerous, and their mission wasn't about money. It was about control. The first attacker lifted the radio to his mouth, his voice trembling. "We've got a problem." "Sir, the woman's." Before he could finish, Sarah moved. With a swift strike, she knocked the radio from his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. But the damage had already been done. She could feel the weight of their unseen leader's presence, as if he were watching from the shadows, waiting for his orders to be carried out. Jack, still standing frozen behind her, had managed to grab his phone. His fingers were trembling as he dialed 911, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what do I say? What's happening? Are we going to die?" Sarah's heart clenched at the desperation in her son's voice, but she forced herself to stay calm, to think, to act. "Tell them everything, Jack. Get them here fast. These men aren't who they say they are. They're dangerous." The words were barely out of her mouth when the second man, having recovered enough to regain his footing, lunged toward her again, his face a mask of hatred. "You should have stayed out of this, lady," he spat, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade gleamed menacingly in the low light, its sharp edge catching the glint of the sunlight filtering through the window. Sarah's pulse spiked, but she was ready. She had no choice but to fight. She had no choice but to protect her son. The man lunged again, but Sarah's instincts kicked in. She grabbed his arm mid-swing, using his momentum against him. With a twist, she wrenched the knife from his hand, sending it clattering across the floor. Without hesitation, she followed up with a brutal elbow to his face, sending him crashing to the ground. He groaned in pain, but Sarah wasn't done yet. She didn't have time to waste on the fallen man. Her eyes locked on the first attacker, who was now recovering from the blow she'd landed earlier. He was starting to rise, and she knew that if he got back on his feet, this fight would drag on even longer. She couldn't afford that. Just as the man began to push himself up, Sarah sprinted toward him, using every ounce of energy left in her body. She grabbed him by the shoulders, her knees driving into his chest, pinning him to the floor with the force of her weight. The struggle was brief, but intense. He thrashed beneath her, but she was relentless. The reality of the situation hit her hard. She wasn't just defending herself. She was fighting for Jack, for her family. And she couldn't stop now. "Jack!" Sarah shouted, her voice harsh with the urgency of the moment. "Get that door locked. No one else is getting in." Jack's voice trembled but carried the weight of understanding. "I'm doing it, Mom. Hurry." But even as Jack rushed to secure the door, Sarah felt the tension in the air thickening. There was a growing sense that the worst was yet to come. She had taken down 2 attackers, but there were more out there. And from the way they had communicated, it was clear they were far from done. This fight, this nightmare, was only just beginning. The sound of Jack's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he bolted toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the lock. Sarah's eyes never left the 2 men on the floor, her body tense, poised like a predator ready to strike again. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and every nerve in her body screamed for her to remain alert, to stay one step ahead. "Mom, it's locked." But Jack's voice faltered, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her gaze snapped to him, her breath catching in her throat. The terror in his eyes mirrored her own. Before Jack could finish his thought, the sound of muffled voices, too far to understand but close enough to send a chill through Sarah, drifted in from the backyard. It was unmistakable. More men. More of them were outside, and judging by the way the first two had fought, they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take. The weight of it crashed into Sarah with the force of a wave. She was no longer just defending her home. She was now trapped in a situation far beyond her control. These men weren't after simple information or property. They were after something that had yet to be revealed, something so important that they were willing to risk everything to get it. And they would keep coming until they had what they wanted. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement behind her. The first man, still reeling from the strikes she'd delivered, was groggily starting to push himself up again. She couldn't let him regain his bearings, not when more threats loomed just outside. With quick precision, Sarah planted a booted foot on his chest, pushing him back down into the floor with enough force to make him gasp. "Stay down," she growled, the words laced with an edge of raw fury. Her breathing was fast, shallow, her muscles burning, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Jack was depending on her. The second attacker, the one who had brandished the knife earlier, had barely moved after the brutal blow she dealt him. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, but he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. She could see the fire in his eyes. Rage, frustration, and a deep-seated determination to finish what he'd started. Jack was behind her now, his voice tight with dread. "Mom, there are more of them. They're circling the house. What do we do?" Sarah's mind raced, the pressure mounting with each second. She could hear the men outside, their voices low, but urgent. The shadows were closing in. They weren't just trying to break in, they were hunting. And they would do anything to get what they wanted. Her eyes flickered toward the kitchen, a small fleeting thought of escape crossing her mind. "We need a way out." But the windows were locked, the back door barricaded by more of the attackers. She'd never make it to the front without running straight into the trap they'd set. "Think," she told herself, pushing aside the panic that clawed at the edges of her mind. "I need a plan. I need to get Jack out." Her gaze fell upon the radio again, still lying on the floor near the first attacker. The last remnants of the voice from the other side still echoed in her mind, sending a shiver down her spine. They weren't here just to break in. They were after something, and someone was controlling it all. "Jack," she said, her voice low and steady despite the chaos. "You need to get to the basement. Now." Jack hesitated, his brow furrowed with confusion and fear. "What? No, I'm not leaving you." "Now, Jack," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Go." His eyes searched hers for a moment. Desperation, fear, and confusion all mingling in his gaze. But then he nodded, trusting his mother's judgment in a way only a son could. Without another word, he bolted down the hall toward the basement door, leaving Sarah alone with the men who still posed an immediate threat. But even as she steeled herself for the next fight, a terrifying realization settled deep in her bones. She was alone. Jack was out of sight, safe for now, but the men wouldn't stop until they found him, until they got what they wanted, and she couldn't protect him from the shadows anymore. She could only delay it. As the seconds ticked by, she heard a voice from the radio again, clearer this time. The voice was unmistakable, cold, commanding, and now urgent. "Report. What is your status?" The first man, still down on the floor, now struggling to rise, managed to lift his head slightly. He rasped, barely able to speak. "The woman, she's tougher than we thought." A cold laugh crackled from the speaker. "It doesn't matter. Finish this. We have other plans for her." Sarah's blood ran cold as the realization struck her. They weren't just here for Jack. They were here for her. The basement door slammed shut behind Jack with a muffled thud, sealing him away from the chaos that was unfolding above. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she heard the click of the latch locking into place. At least he's safe, for now. But safety was a fragile thing, and she knew the men wouldn't give up. Not when they were so close. Her thoughts were interrupted by the growl of one of the attackers, still struggling to rise from the floor. The first man had somehow managed to push himself to his knees, blood trickling down his face. He glared up at her, rage flickering in his eyes. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he spat, his voice rough and strained. "But I can see now, you're not like the others. You're not just some scared housewife." Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't want to engage with him, didn't want to waste any more time. But something in his words, something about how he viewed her, made the blood in her veins run cold. He wasn't just talking about her skills. He was talking about what she was capable of, what she could do. She stepped back, taking a breath, her eyes scanning the room for anything that could give her an advantage. The sculpture was still lying on the floor, but there was no time for that. She needed something faster, something she could use to escape. Her gaze darted to the kitchen. The back door. It's still locked, but the windows. But just as quickly as the thought formed, she heard another sound. The unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel outside, followed by a series of soft commands. The men were organizing, coordinating their next move. No longer was this just a raid. It was a hunt. The first man's eyes narrowed, reading the shift in Sarah's expression. He grinned, sensing her growing anxiety. "You're not going anywhere. They'll be here any second." His voice was filled with smug certainty, like a man who knew the game was over. They think they've won, she realized, but her mind clicked into survival mode. There was always a way out. Think. She had to move fast, before they realized Jack was hidden. They hadn't even checked the basement yet, but it was only a matter of time before they did. She couldn't afford to wait. The risk of them turning their attention back to Jack, of discovering his hiding place, was too great. A plan began to form in her mind, one that teetered on the edge of insanity, but she had no choice. She had to gamble everything. "Where is it?" The voice crackled again from the radio on the floor, sending a jolt of terror through Sarah. It was the same voice, sharp, authoritative, and dripping with impatience. The first man's face tightened, but his response was clipped, strained with obvious effort. "It's not here yet. We have to get her." Sarah moved with the swiftness of someone who knew there was no other choice. She grabbed the radio from the floor, cradling it in her hands as if it were a weapon. "I'll give you one chance to get the hell out of my house." Her voice was low, threatening, almost a whisper, but it carried with it the cold finality of someone who had nothing left to lose. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell are you?" Before he could react, Sarah smashed the radio against the floor, breaking it into pieces. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a stillness that made her pulse race with a sense of impending dread. But she didn't stop. Quickly, Sarah turned toward the kitchen, moving with precision. She knew she had seconds, maybe less. She grabbed a sharp butcher knife from the counter and held it in her hand with steady resolve. She wasn't ready to be caught off guard again. Not now. But just as she was about to make her move, a new voice called out from outside, the sound of someone walking briskly toward the back door. It was the unmistakable shuffle of boots on gravel, the sound of a man preparing for something violent. The door handle jiggled and Sarah froze. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment. "They're here. They found us." It was now or never. She moved swiftly toward the door, reaching for the kitchen knife, her body tensed like a coiled spring. The moment the door opened, she would strike. But just before she could act, she heard a voice she didn't expect. "Mom." It was Jack. Her heart surged with a combination of fear and relief. But her mind snapped back to the present. No, she couldn't let him come back upstairs. Not now. She reached for the basement door, her voice sharp and full of warning. Jack, stay downstairs. Don't come out. But the voice from outside the door was growing louder, the handle turning again. And this time, it was clear. There was no more time. The door handle rattled violently, and Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as she backed away, the knife in her hand now feeling like a poor excuse for defense against the oncoming storm. She could hear the voice of the man outside, the heavy footsteps, but the real fear was Jack. He was still upstairs. She couldn't afford to lose him now. Mom. His voice again, louder this time, full of uncertainty and fear. Her mind screamed at her to make him stay hidden, to make him listen. But the seconds were ticking by, each one like an eternity. She couldn't let him come upstairs, not when the men were so close. Her eyes darted to the basement door again, just beyond her reach. Was it locked? Had he stayed inside? The question gnawed at her, but there was no time to confirm. She had to act now. Her thoughts flickered back to the voice on the radio, the voice that had issued orders with such cold authority. Whoever he was, whatever his plans were, Sarah knew they had only just begun. This wasn't some random home invasion. This was coordinated, ruthless, and it was far from over. The back door rattled once more, the handle now being forced down with a frightening amount of strength. Sarah's eyes shot to the knife she gripped in her hand, its blade catching the dim light from the kitchen. She clenched her jaw, the grim determination flooding her every movement. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat. Jack was moving toward her. Jack? No, she hissed, her voice shaking but urgent. She stepped toward the stairway, every muscle in her body aching with the strain of trying to hold it all together. But as she moved closer, the footsteps on the stairs halted, as if her words had reached him. Her pulse raced as she listened. Mom. Jack's voice cracked, quieter now, a tremble of fear in it that twisted her heart. They're not just here for you, are they? Her gut twisted at his question. No, they're not here for me. The realization hit her like a freight train. The men weren't after her. They weren't after anything personal. They were after him. Jack, get back to the basement, now, she commanded, barely able to contain the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. But it was too late. The first man, the one who had been down earlier, was already on his feet. His face was a mask of pain and fury as he stumbled toward her, blood dripping from his lip. I told you, he growled, swiping the blood from his chin. You should have stayed out of this. And then, just as Sarah moved to lunge at him, something unexpected happened. The door burst open. A flood of men rushed into the house, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the room like predators scenting their prey. The initial attackers were joined by new figures, tall, imposing men, all wearing dark tactical gear. They moved with military precision, closing in from all sides. Sarah's mind raced. There's no way out. There's no way to fight them all off. And then, through the chaos and noise, she heard it, a voice, a cold, calculating voice that sent a chill straight down her spine. Enough. The men froze. The man who had spoken emerged from the shadows, his features obscured by the darkness. But his presence was undeniable. He stood taller than the rest, his cold eyes fixed on Sarah with a predatory gleam. Step aside, Marcus, the voice ordered, its tone sharp and commanding. The first attacker, Marcus, grimaced but obeyed, stepping back with a reluctant growl. Sarah's breath hitched. This was him, the leader, the one behind it all. She could feel his gaze on her, measuring her like she was some object, some insignificant piece of a larger game. His face was still shrouded, but she could tell he was calculating. He knew exactly what he wanted. I'm sorry for the theatrics, the voice continued, stepping into the light. His face was covered by a black mask, but his eyes were piercing, cold, ruthless. But we've reached a point where pleasantries are no longer necessary. "I assume you're aware of what we're after, Mrs. Walters." Sarah's blood ran cold. He knew who I was. It wasn't just about her house. It was about something far more dangerous. They were after Jack. She gripped the knife tighter, feeling the weight of it, but also realizing how futile it was against the force of the men surrounding her. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out. But all she saw were dark eyes and cold, determined faces. "You're after my son," she said, her voice low and full of defiance, even as fear clawed at her throat. The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. Very perceptive. His eyes flicked toward the basement door. "But let's not keep him waiting, shall we?" The leader's cold gaze never wavered as he stepped closer, the sound of his boots on the floor sending an icy shiver down Sarah's spine. The men flanked him like wolves, but he was the predator, calculating, efficient, and utterly relentless. "We both know how this ends," he said, his voice low and commanding. He motioned to the basement door. "Get him. I want him now." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her stomach dropped, but she refused to show fear. She couldn't. Not now. Not when Jack's life was on the line. With every fiber of her being, she wanted to rush forward, to charge at the man who threatened her son. But Sarah knew that attacking them head-on would be suicide. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and everything she loved was at their mercy. "You won't touch him," Sarah said, her voice shaking, but fierce. She was ready to fight, to die if necessary, but she wasn't backing down. The leader tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You think you're in control." His eyes bored into hers with a chilling confidence. "This house, this situation, it's already over. We have more than you could ever imagine. Your son, your future, none of it matters. We're getting what we came for." His words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she stood her ground, gripping the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about survival. This wasn't about protecting herself. It was about keeping her son safe. But as the first man, Marcus, moved toward the basement door, Sarah's instincts flared. She couldn't let them get to Jack. The door swung open, the floor creaking in protest as Marcus made his way down the stairs. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears, her pulse racing faster than she could process. Without thinking, Sarah hurled herself toward him, adrenaline flooding her system. The men around her shifted, and for a brief, fleeting second, they hesitated. It was all the time she needed. She slammed into Marcus's side with every ounce of force she had, knocking him off balance. The knife she held was aimed with lethal precision, but before she could strike, another attacker grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. Pain exploded through her wrist, but Sarah refused to scream. Her mind was sharp, focused. She kicked out, catching another man in the ribs with a sharp, brutal blow. But even as she fought back, she could feel their hold tightening. She was surrounded. Every escape route closed off. She was being cornered. Just then, a shout from below caught her attention. "Mom!" No, it was Jack's voice, filled with panic, desperate. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, and Sarah's mind was flooded with the realization that they were closing in on him. It was happening too quickly. Her heart raced with a cold, primal fear she couldn't suppress. In that instant, everything seemed to slow down. The room became suffocating. The weight of the men around her, their overpowering presence, was like a vise crushing her chest. Then, from the shadows, a sound broke through the tense silence. The sharp crack of glass. The front window shattered. It wasn't just a random sound. It was an explosion of glass shards that scattered across the room. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound, her breath caught in her throat. The men froze, caught off guard for the briefest of moments. It was then that she saw him, another figure emerging from the broken window, his movements swift and purposeful. A flash of recognition ignited in her chest. It was a face she hadn't seen in years. Tom, her ex-husband, Jack's father, stood there, crouched in the broken window frame, a rifle in his hands. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, there was a flicker of something unspoken between them, a shared moment of understanding. He was here. The leader's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice full of venom. But Tom didn't hesitate. He aimed the rifle with pinpoint precision and fired a shot straight into the ceiling, sending a sharp echo through the room. The men flinched, some ducking instinctively. "Get down to the basement," Tom commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Now, without a word, Sarah grabbed Jack's arm from the top of the stairs, her hands shaking with relief and fear. She yanked him down into the basement, pushing him ahead of her. The men were scrambling, but Tom's presence had given them pause. It was enough of a distraction to allow them to escape, for now. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah heard the sound of footsteps following. The men weren't far behind, but just as she turned to grab the basement door, a deafening crash echoed from above. The game was far from over.